A federal judge has ordered the administration to begin refunding $130 billion worth of tariffs. Lydia, who's been following the story. OK, Lydia, how many companies have filed lawsuits to get their money back?
Stuart, thousands.
Thousands.
By counts, it's more than 2,000 companies that have filed their lawsuits, according to reports. We were talking about big business, Costco, FedEx, Pandora, and they're looking to benefit from the tariff challenges that were initiated. Remember, it was the small businesses who filed the lawsuits. Now the big businesses are lining up to get their money back as well. The judge's order is coming after the Supreme Court invalidated some of President Trump's tariff powers just last month. And this order directs U.S. Customs and Border Protection to begin recalculating duties that importers paid and determine how much money needs to be returned. Now, on top of returning the tariffs to be paid, the estimates range, as you said, from $130 billion upwards of $175 billion. The government also revealed in a new filing that it will also pay interest on the refunds. That's estimated by the Cato Institute to be $700 million per month. Now, I talked with a group that represents the small businesses, and she says her clients on Main Street are finally getting clarity. Listen to this.
All right, people. Dr. John here. So what just happened, guys? A federal judge just ordered the Trump administration to refund between $130 and $175 billion in tariffs, the largest court-mandated government reimbursement in American trade history, because the Supreme Court already ruled those tariffs were illegal.
I have one business that I talked to who was on a waiting list for 2 years for a piece of machinery so that he could manufacture in the United States, but the machinery was coming from a highly tariffed country. So now perhaps he'll be able to buy that machine.
Now, what does remain unclear at this moment, Stuart, is the process for the refunds. And the government has said it's going to be a painstaking endeavor requiring manual review of millions of import entries. But others are pushing back on that claim. They insist this could be automated. So the judge now has ordered a private conference. It's scheduled for tomorrow. They're going to hash out this process. So I'm going to be on the lookout for information coming from that. But this court order directing the refunds, it does come after the president and administration officials suggested refunds would not be automatic here. And Democrats like Senator Elizabeth Warren are seizing on those comments, amplifying claims that refunds be made. We reached out to the CBP, the White House, and DOJ. No comment just yet, Stuart. But as always, I would not be surprised if the administration appeals this recent order.
I wouldn't be surprised either. Thanks, Lydia.
Yeah.
Good.
Interest is compounding at $700 million every single month the refunds don't go out. The companies waiting in line aren't small businesses. They're Costco, FedEx, and major importers across dozens of industries who paid duties the government had no legal authority to collect. The tariff gamble didn't just fail politically. It came with a $175 billion price tag.
A federal judge is delaying the timeline for tariff refunds. It's a key win for the Trump administration as it tries to navigate the ramifications of that landmark Supreme Court case which struck down many of the president's tariffs. Here to break down everything we know on this decision is the Hill's courts and legal reporter, Zach Schoenfeld. Zach, thanks so much for joining us. The judge had originally said that he wanted immediate action on the refunds, but now appears to be softening the timeline. Why is that, and what does his new order say?
Hey, Judy, this is really a shift here from the judge after there was originally a hearing last week, as you mentioned, where the judge really wanted to move full steam ahead, saying that this refund process shouldn't be complicated. But then the Trump administration really was expressing concerns that they wouldn't be able to comply. They emphasized the fact that we're talking about tens of millions of tariff entries that need to be looked at here. And so they've said that they're in the process of actually standing up an electronic system to help manage this process and to go through those entries. And they say that that's going to take time. They say they've asked actually specifically for up to 45 days to stand up that system. So a timeline that would get things going around mid to late April or so. And now following that, the judge has walked back some of these orders to immediately comply. He wants an update from the government on their progress by Thursday, but still a shift here, seemingly now a big win for the Trump administration, giving them a little bit more breathing room to figure out some of the processes to get these refunds out.
How much money does the Trump administration have to refund, and how many companies would be involved in that process?
Trump devoted years standing before rally crowds and informing his devoted supporters that his tariff regime was compelling foreign nations to bear the cost, that China was footing the bill, that the trade imbalance was being rectified upon the backs of overseas exporters who possessed no alternative but to absorb the financial burden of his brilliant negotiating prowess. And now, a federal judge, acting in direct implementation of a Supreme Court ruling that declared those tariffs were unconstitutional from their very inception.
Well, Judy, actually, just here in the last few days, we've finally gotten an accurate picture of this data after it was really just estimates up until this point. So according to this new data from customs officials, that $166 billion were paid by importers over the last year in these tariffs that have now been struck down by the Supreme Court. So $166 billion in total. That comes from more than 330,000 importers who have been paying these tariffs. And as I mentioned a few moments ago, we're talking about more than 50 million different tariff entries. So you can just see by some of the numbers here that even though there is some precedence here where there have been tariffs that have been refunded before, I mean, just the sheer scale that we're talking about, where the government is facing the prospect of having to refund nearly $200 billion, is quite something, especially when you even start thinking about that interest is going to have to be applied to all of this.
That's a whole lot of cash. While the Trump administration's act is pushing to delay these refunds as long as possible, the judge brought up a key point related to the interest on those refunds, which could make the total cost go up even more. What can you tell us about that?
Has ordered the government to return every dollar, not to foreign governments, to American businesses, because the tariffs were never remitted by foreign nations. They were paid by American importers at the border, and American importers are now legally entitled to receive full restitution with interest for every single dollar of an unconstitutional tax that Trump assured them was somebody else's concern. Let me provide the complete and unvarnished portrait of what this judicial order actually signifies.
Yeah, this is something that we've known was going to be a thing as this tariff case was moving along, that if we got to this moment where the Supreme Court has struck down the tariffs and they need to be refunded, the law says that refunds also needs to include interest. So to be clear, I've been listening into these court hearings, and this has been a position that the Trump administration itself has even acknowledged, that these refunds are going to have interest payments. I don't have the specific number of how much that is going to amount to, but if you just start thinking about the math here, $166 billion in payments, no matter what exact interest rate gets applied, you're talking about billions of dollars in additional costs. And of course, that's a number that is only continuing to grow by the day, and each and every day that these tariffs are not refunded as this process grows. So like I said, $166 billion is what was actually paid, but that number is just going to continue to grow as we get into the spring here until that money actually changes hands.
Zach, what should we be keeping an eye on in the coming days, the coming weeks as this case develops?
Because the financial figures involved are so astronomically larger than ordinary comprehension suggests, that the political collapse framing, if anything, represents a profound understatement of the genuine catastrophe unfolding. We are examining a potential refund exposure that commences at $130 billion.
I'd say keep an eye out for two different fronts here. The first is specifically here on refunds, and that is watch to see what companies and lawyers are really become the key players here as they jostle to be the ones to lead this fight. Really in the last week, there has actually been a Nashville-based filtration company. It's called Atmos. That has emerged all of a sudden as the lead company in this refund fight. This is a different company than the ones at the Supreme Court. And you actually now have the companies that were at the Supreme Court now going back down to this trade court and urging them to let them in on the action too, and to be part of these negotiations and proceedings. Unclear if they're going to be allowed to do so. So far, there has been no sign that they will, but still we're seeing some signs actually of a bit of, like I said, jostling among the attorneys here. So that's one thing to watch. And then something else on just a bit of a different front here is we've, of course, been talking about these tariffs that were struck down by the Supreme Court. The president still moving ahead on his new round of global tariffs, which he says are still legal following that Supreme Court decision. But just in the last few days, we have begun to see new lawsuits over those tariffs as well. A group of blue states has newly filed a lawsuit challenging those. So no word yet from the courts on a ruling yet in that case. It's just getting underway. But in the next few weeks, that's going to be one to watch too, Judy.
And could expand substantially because trade attorneys have informed financial publications that the administration has now acknowledged in formal court submissions that a broad spectrum of tariff categories may ultimately qualify for restitution, including certain duties that had already been collected in full. This means the pool of money the government potentially owes continues expanding even as the interest meter runs at $700 million monthly. To provide meaningful context, $700 million per month in interest alone exceeds the annual operating budget of numerous federal agencies. It surpasses what the United States allocates to many essential programs and services that citizens actually require and desire. And this amount accumulates automatically each month as a direct and traceable consequence of Trump's determination to impose tariffs that the Supreme Court ruled he never possessed constitutional authority to impose. This is not a philosophical disagreement regarding optimal trade strategy. This is a judicially mandated financial accounting for an unconstitutional experiment in governance by emergency proclamation. And the invoice is being presented to American taxpayers who were assured for years that someone else was covering the cost. Here are the specific facts constituting the foundation of this narrative. Major news outlets reported that a federal judge ordered the Trump administration to initiate refunding an estimated $130 billion to $175 billion in tariffs, plus interest approaching $700 million monthly. That order flows directly from the Supreme Court's determinations declaring the vast majority of Trump's emergency tariffs illegal, based on the finding that the International Emergency Economic Powers Act does not grant the president authority to impose tariffs. The Supreme Court established the constitutional violation. The federal court order established the reimbursement mandate. And the trade lawyers advising corporate clients regarding subsequent steps are informing them that the administration's concession in court filings, acknowledging that a broad spectrum of tariffs may qualify for refunds, indicates the total liability is not fixed at the lower boundary of current estimates. It could expand considerably. And the interest clock, running at $700 million monthly, guarantees that any delay in processing reimbursements merely enlarges the total obligation with each rotation of the calendar. Financial and legal analysts have characterized the refund order as component of a broader pattern wherein courts are constraining Trump's expansive conception of executive authority, converting his emergency instruments into liabilities that impose enormous costs upon the government. That characterization is accurate, and the enormous sum in this specific instance is quantified in hundreds of billions with an interest mechanism that does not cease operation until the payments are fully distributed. Now let us examine what Trump communicated to Americans regarding who was bearing the tariff burden, because the chasm between his assertions and what the court order now reveals constitutes one of the most politically devastating dimensions of this entire saga. For years, at gathering after gathering, interview after interview, social media broadcast after social media broadcast, Trump insisted with absolute certitude that his tariffs were being funded by foreign countries, that China was paying, that nations running trade surpluses who had allegedly exploited America for generations were finally settling the account for their unfair commercial practices, that American consumers and businesses were not absorbing the cost, that the tariffs represented essentially free revenue for the American government extracted from foreign exporters who possessed no choice but to accept the burden. That was the political mythology, and it was fundamentally false. Economists, including those generally sympathetic to trade protection as a policy instrument, consistently articulated that tariffs are paid by importers, American businesses at the point of entry, when merchandise arrives in the United States, and that those costs are subsequently either absorbed by the enterprises, diminishing their margins and constraining their capacity to invest and employ, or transferred to consumers through elevated prices. The tariffs were invariably a tax on Americans. Trump informed Americans someone else was remitting payment. And now a federal judge implementing Supreme Court precedent has issued an order confirming the reality that economists were communicating from the beginning. The tariffs were paid by American businesses. Those businesses are entitled to restitution. And the restitution derives from government funds, which signifies American taxpayers, the very people Trump assured were receiving a complimentary benefit on foreign nations' account, are the ones who ultimately finance his his unconstitutional trade experiment. The Costco and FedEx dimension merits particular examination because these are household designations that transform abstract financial magnitudes into concrete and relatable terms for ordinary citizens. Costco ranks among the largest importing entities in the United States, bringing in enormous volumes of merchandise that its membership purchases weekly. When Trump imposed tariffs on those goods, Costco remitted the duties at the border, and those costs contributed to the pricing pressures that Costco and every other major retailer have been navigating for years. FedEx manages international shipping and importing at massive scale, and tariff costs have constituted a genuine factor in its operational expenses throughout the tariff period. Both corporations now possess legal entitlement to refunds, potentially extraordinarily substantial refunds, from a government that collected the money under legal authority that never existed. And the political imagery of Costco and FedEx receiving checks from the Treasury, while ordinary Americans who experienced elevated prices at retail establishments recover, nothing is a political image that encapsulates something genuinely significant about who benefits and who bears cost when government policy faces judicial reversal. The corporations sufficiently sophisticated to track every tariff dollar and submit detailed refund claims recover their funds. The consumers who paid elevated prices at checkout receive no corresponding restitution. That asymmetry between corporate refund beneficiaries and consumer price burdens is a political vulnerability that no quantity of strongman trade rhetoric can effectively obscure. Let us descend deeper into every stratum of what this refund order signifies and why its consequences extend far beyond the specific monetary amounts to reshape the political and economic terrain of Trump's second term in ways that continue developing. There exists the fiscal dimension. What $130 to $175 billion in refund exposure plus $700 million monthly in interest signifies for government finances and for the policy alternatives that become displaced by this obligation. There exists the economic credibility dimension. What the conjunction of the tariff falsehood and the court order exposing it signifies for Trump's most essential political brand assertion that he constitutes an economic genius who produces results. There exists the legal precedent dimension, how the refund order connects to the broader pattern of courts constraining Trump's emergency power assertions, and what it portends for every other emergency initiative resting upon comparable constitutional foundations. There exists the consumer versus corporation dimension, the political liability generated by a circumstance wherein corporations receive restitution payments, while consumers who absorbed elevated prices for years recover nothing. And there exists the Iran connection, how the disintegration of Trump's tariff economic leverage instrument compounds the strategic crisis generated by his unauthorized Iran military engagement. We shall address each sequentially. Commence with the fiscal dimension, because the magnitudes involved are so immense they warrant serious examination rather than treatment as abstraction. $130 to $175 billion represents a staggering sum comparable to the annual budgets of major federal departments, the category of money that embodies genuine determinations regarding what government can and cannot accomplish. That money was collected from American importers under legal authority that the Supreme Court has now adjudicated never existed, which signifies the government collected it unlawfully and now bears legal obligation to return it with accumulated interest. At $700 million monthly, the fiscal impact of that obligation does not manifest in isolation. It manifests within a federal budget already experiencing pressure, and it constitutes an enormous unplanned expenditure created exclusively by a presidential determination to impose tariffs he lacked constitutional authorization to impose. Every dollar of refund and every dollar of interest represents a dollar unavailable for alternative allocation, defense, infrastructure, healthcare, tax reduction, whatever policy priority any member of Congress would prefer to fund. This refund obligation competes directly with those alternatives. And that competition between Trump's unconstitutional trade experiment and every other spending priority is a fiscal reality that Republican members of Congress, already apprehensive regarding the tariff agenda, must now explain to constituents and to fiscal conservatives within their own conference. Now examine the economic credibility dimension, because this is where the court order inflicts its most politically enduring damage. Trump's economic brand, the genius entrepreneur, the master negotiator who comprehends financial mechanics, the president who would enrich America by compelling foreign nations to remit payment. That brand is constructed upon a specific factual assertion that his economic policies generate American prosperity at foreign competitors' expense. The tariff narrative was the signature expression of that assertion. Free money from China, the trade surplus nations finally contributing their equitable portion, Americans prevailing because Trump possessed sufficient determination to enforce payment, and the court order following the Supreme Court ruling establishes through legal documentation and dollar quantification that the assertion was false. The tariffs were not free money from China. They were unlawful taxes on American businesses collected without constitutional authorization that the government must now repay with interest at $700 million monthly. That is not a political argument opposing Trump's economic theory. That is a court order quantifying in currency the cost of the disparity between what he claimed and what was actually occurring. And political brands constructed upon factual assertions that courts have now specifically and measurably disproven are not sustainable brands, particularly in suburban districts where college-educated voters attend to specifics and are already migrating substantially away from the MAGA affiliation. Now examine the legal precedent dimension, because the refund order is the downstream consequence of the Supreme Court ruling, and it establishes a pattern bearing implications for every other emergency power initiative this administration has pursued. The pattern follows this sequence. Trump asserts emergency authority, deploys it at substantial scale. The courts adjudicate that the authority never existed. The government then confronts massive financial exposure, having collected money or imposed costs based on authority that was perpetually unconstitutional. The tariff case represents the most financially visible manifestation of this pattern, because tariffs are dollar quantifiable in ways that certain other executive overreaches are not. But the principle that unconstitutional executive action generates legal obligations surviving the political moment applies across domains. Immigration enforcement measures undertaken under questionable legal authority generate legal claims. Regulatory impositions deployed through emergency proclamations can generate damages claims if courts determine the proclamations were invalid. The refund order is not exclusively about tariffs. It concerns the legal and financial ramifications of governing through emergency decree, and it establishes that those ramifications are authentic, measurable, and financed by taxpayers who possess no voice in the determination to impose the unconstitutional policy initially. Now examine the consumer versus corporation dimension, because the political optics of this circumstance warrant careful scrutiny. The corporations receiving refund payments, Costco, FedEx, major importers across numerous industries, are substantial enterprises with sophisticated legal and accounting operations that track every tariff dollar remitted and are fully equipped to submit detailed and well-substantiated refund applications. The consumers who absorbed elevated prices at retail establishments because those corporations transferred tariff costs through the supply chain possess no corresponding restitution mechanism. They remitted more for merchandise. The courts will not dispatch them reimbursement. The corporations recover their funds. The consumers do not. That asymmetry, large corporations receiving government restitution payments while ordinary consumers who absorbed elevated prices throughout years of the tariff regime recover nothing, is a political narrative that cuts directly contrary to the populist economic message Trump has cultivated. He marketed the tariffs as assertive economic policy, standing with working Americans against foreign adversaries and corporate elites. The refund order communicates a different narrative, a policy that was unlawful, that cost working Americans elevated prices, and that is now being unwound in a manner delivering hundreds of billions of dollars to corporations, while the individuals who remitted more for groceries and household items recover nothing. That is not a populist triumph, that is a populist betrayal, and it is documented in a court order measured in dollars, with the names of corporate refund recipients clearly present in the legal documentation. Now connect the refund order to the Iran military engagement, because the two narratives narratives are not separate. They are both manifestations of the identical governance failure, and they are landing concurrently in a manner that compounds the political injury of each. The Iran war strategy depended upon credible economic leverage, the threat of catastrophic tariffs and sanctions rendering compliance more attractive than continued resistance. The Supreme Court adjudicated that the primary mechanism for that economic leverage was unconstitutional. The refund order now quantifies the financial cost of having deployed that mechanism and establishes that the government must repay the money collected through an unlawful instrument. So the economic component of the Iran strategy is not merely politically compromised. It is financially costing the government $700 million monthly in interest on the unlawful tariffs, while the military component generates war crimes, concerns, and impeachment articles. A president losing on both the economic and military dimensions of his Iran strategy simultaneously in ways measured in dollars and in impeachment counts is a president whose strategic position is deteriorating in every direction concurrently. And the political brand constructed upon economic genius and military strength is absorbing simultaneous direct strikes from both directions in ways that reinforce rather than cancel one another. Let us distill this into 4 clear points, providing the complete and interconnected portrait of what the refund order signifies, why it carries significance for the economy and for politics, and what approaches as the financial consequences of Trump's unconstitutional trade experiment continue compounding. The refund order constitutes the financial accounting for a falsehood Trump communicated to Americans for years, and it is measured in dollars that render the falsehood impossible to deny or dismiss. He asserted foreign nations were remitting the tariffs. The court order confirms American businesses paid them unlawfully and are entitled to recover them with interest. $130 to $175 billion in refunds, $700 million monthly in interest. Those are authentic numbers in an authentic court order following an authentic Supreme Court ruling that collectively establish in the most concrete and dollar-quantified terms achievable that the narrative Trump constructed around his tariff policy was false. Courts do not issue refund orders for policies that were lawful and justified. They issue them for policies that were unlawful and unconstitutional. And the existence of this order at this magnitude is the judicial record of precisely how unlawful and how expensive Trump's emergency tariff experiment actually was. The $700 million monthly interest mechanism is a political and fiscal emergency that intensifies with each passing day. The refunds remain unprocessed, and the administration possesses no favorable options for addressing it. Processing $130 to $175 billion in refund claims presents a logistical challenge of immense proportions, one that customs and trade administrative systems were not designed to accommodate at this velocity or volume. Each month of processing delay adds $700 million to the total exposure. The administration may attempt to slow walk the refunds, but courts have ordered them to commence, meaning further delay risks contempt proceedings atop the financial liability. And every news cycle featuring the interest clock advancing upward is a news cycle reminding voters and businesses and markets that the government is remitting an enormous and continuing financial penalty for Trump's unconstitutional trade experiment. That is not a narrative that dissipates through a press release or a social media post. It is a meter operating publicly and measurably each day. The consumer versus corporation refund asymmetry constitutes a populist political vulnerability that Democrats are already constructing campaign communications around and to which Republican members in competitive districts possess no satisfactory response. Corporations receive refund payments. Consumers who absorbed elevated prices recover nothing. The businesses sufficiently sophisticated to document every tariff dollar are the beneficiaries of the court-ordered unwinding. The working Americans who remitted more for goods weekly for years are not. That asymmetry, documented in the legal architecture of the refund process, directly contradicts the populist economic brand Trump constructed around the tariff policy. In campaign messaging targeting Republican members who endorsed the tariff agenda, that asymmetry will be presented in the simplest and most effective terms achievable. Your representative voted for a policy that elevated your prices. Courts adjudicated it was unlawful, and the reimbursement payments are going to corporations while you receive nothing. That message resonates. benefits, and it resonates most powerfully in precisely the suburban districts where the electoral terrain is already transforming. The refund order connects the Supreme Court's constitutional ruling to daily economic and political reality in ways that abstract legal principles cannot accomplish, and it ensures that the consequences of Trump's unconstitutional emergency governance experiment are visible and measurable rather than theoretical. The tariff narrative is now not merely a constitutional law narrative regarding IEEPA limitations. It is a money narrative, a refund narrative, a corporations receiving payments while taxpayers finance the obligation narrative. That transformation from abstract constitutional principle to concrete financial consequence is what renders the refund order politically significant beyond its immediate legal effect. Courts constrain presidential power regularly, and those constraints frequently vanish into legal documents that most voters never examine. But a judge ordering the government to repay $130 to $175 billion with $700 million monthly in interest, that is a figure that receives coverage on local news affiliates, that receives discussion at kitchen tables, that receives citation in campaign advertisements, and that renders abstract constitutional overreach visible to the individuals who ultimately determine electoral outcomes. Here is the fundamental reality. A federal judge ordered the Trump administration to commence refunding an estimated $130 billion to $175 billion in unlawfully collected tariffs, plus interest reaching nearly $700 million monthly following the Supreme Court's determination that IEEPA does not authorize presidential tariff imposition. Trade attorneys indicate the administration has conceded in court submissions that a broad spectrum of tariffs may qualify for refunds, signifying the total exposure could expand. Costco, FedEx, and major American importers spanning numerous industries await refund payments, while consumers who absorbed elevated prices for years possess no corresponding recovery mechanism. The interest mechanism operates at $700 million monthly, enlarging the total exposure. Each day refunds remain unprocessed. Analysts characterize the order as component of a pattern wherein courts are constraining Trump's expansive executive authority conception, converting his emergency instruments into liabilities imposing enormous governmental costs. The tariffs he asserted foreign nations were remitting are being refunded to American businesses from government funds, with taxpayers ultimately financing his unconstitutional trade experiment. The disintegration is not exclusively political. It is financial, documented, court-ordered, and measured in hundreds of billions of dollars that the government now legally owes because one president determined he could impose whatever tariffs he desired through emergency declaration. And the Supreme Court responded with absolute clarity. No, you cannot.